On this episode of the podcast, I have with me James Evans. He's the co-founder and CEO of CommandBar that recently was acquired by Amplitude. We're going to be talking about first-time founders and leadership styles with him, and we're going to dive into early career experiences. What are those first-time founder leadership experiences look like? Trial and error. How do you refine some of those leadership styles as you're growing as a founder? And who do you turn to for help and feedback? James, super excited to have you on to talk to us about this. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Very fun topic.
Absolutely. All right. So you obviously have gone through a recent acquisition. You're a founder, so I'm sure you have some great takeaways to provide on this topic. And this one, we're going to be talking about first-time founders, right? Obviously, once you're a serial founder, you have some different experience to draw from. When it's your first time to go around and you are trying to get something off the ground, especially when it comes to the leadership style, you've been an IC, you might have been a manager, you might not have, but owning your own company is different in terms of being a leader. Kind of dive in, start there with us.
It's like an impossibly hard thing to do. I think this first surfaced for me when we started, interviewing people to hire our first, 10 people or whatever. And I started getting this question, you give candidates the opportunity to ask questions, and it's just, they're interviewing you as much as you're interviewing them, especially in a startup context. And people will ask, like, hey, what's your leadership style? And I remember the first time I got that question, I was like, oh my God, like, I have no idea how to answer that question. Like, existential crisis. Like, do I have a leadership style? What do I want it to be? What do I tell this person? At this point, I've, been stalling for like 5 seconds. And the answer is, I think, it's really hard. I think it's basically a binary situation with first-time founders, where if you're a first-time founder, and we can talk about like, you ask the question, like, who do you source ideas from and get advice from? And we can talk a lot more about this, but I think the first thing to realize is that no one is going to, unless you have that exemplar in your previous professional history, no one's going to hand you oh, this is the leadership style on a plate. You kind of just got to build it from convictions you have about the type of company you want to build, and then iterate. My answer to that question remains I'm still figuring out my leadership style. Here are some things I believe. Here are some things that have worked really well for us so far. But the main gist of my leadership style is I'm still developing it, and I'm open to feedback. And I think that's a real hack and something people aren't used to hearing, because I think in response to that question, a lot of people will give you apple pie stuff. I believe in empowering people. I believe in, hard work. I believe in, bringing your whole self to work, stuff that we've all heard, but it's kind of meaningless. And so I think it's kind of a refreshing perspective.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. And as you were mentioning this, being asked in interviews about leadership style, I started thinking about where people actually start getting this idea of ask about leadership styles at startups, right? Is it something that Hollywood has glamorized, the Valley has glamorized, the Steve Jobs, the Musks of the world, and you see them, they're, out on social media, you start thinking there's a particular persona or profile, and people wonder, where do you align? And I guess different leader styles, different types of leaders and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. That's my opinion. I could be completely wrong. Maybe it's something that's super important in joining a startup, and that's a vital question. But if you're interviewing with a company and that's a first-time founder, is there a certain amount of expectation from the candidate? I mean, obviously, they probably don't have it, but when it comes to expectations from the candidate, what do you think they're looking for? Are they trying to find the manager style that's a fit for them? Are they worried about running into that founder that's going to want them to work 90 hours a week? Is that really what they're trying to ask? I guess, what do you think they're hoping to understand with that leadership style question?
I think that's a big part of it, what you just said. I do think you're kind of scanning for, the right tail, left tail, weirdness, and that's a thing. I think something that has, a framework that has helped me a lot is this idea that as a startup, you should actually seek to innovate as little as possible. Pick the spots where you're innovating. It's probably your product strategy. It might be not your product strategy. It might be your distribution strategy. It might be your marketing strategy. But if you don't need to innovate somewhere, don't, because you're just adding existential risks to your company. And I think leadership style is one of those. And some people make it their, like, they innovate and make it their bet. You know, maybe Steve Jobs is one of those people. I think an interesting example is, I guess you'd call this leadership style, is back in 2020 or whatever, when Coinbase did the like, we're not political at work thing, that like created a lot of, you know, opinions on both sides. And that, you know, I'm sure Brian Armstrong thinks of that decision as like critical to success of the company, but like not every founder, and especially not first time founders, like need to innovate on leadership style. And it's weird because it's super tempting in the moment when someone asks you that question to like want to say something like really inspirational or like really unique. But I think the reality for most founders is like, that's not somewhere you're going to innovate. And it's like totally fun. You have to say something is the challenge. You can't just say like, I have no leadership style. Like I just work hard, because it's like not inspiring. But you can pick a few, something like I'm still working on it. Something like, you know, I believe in hiring a smaller number of highly effective people and giving them more responsibility. That's definitely something that I believed in, and we executed and worked. So I kept doing it. So I guess the answer is like, decide whether you're going to innovate on leadership style. You should have a pretty strong perspective on what that thing is going to be. It probably should be informed by past experience. And if you don't have that, like pick some things you believe in and go, and just realize that it's okay not to innovate.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I'm wondering, you mentioned, you know, you could pick some of the buzzy word leadership, you know, concepts out there. There's plenty to pick from. You could talk about emulating somebody that people know. I mean, those are all things you can do. I guess and maybe just from your experience, when you're looking at that, if you do go down that path, you actually have to back it up, right? So you could say, you know, I'm a servant leader. That's fantastic. You actually have to then go do the actions. Yeah, you actually have to do or whatever leadership style that you subscribe to. You have to actually back it up with the actions so that people go, oh, I see this. I guess when it comes to just general leadership style, being a founder, it's all new, especially if you're first time, and knowing yourself. Is there that, you know, that's that learning process and knowing yourself and that leadership style and trying to, like you said, not innovate potentially on that. How does that dynamic work? Because I think that's very tricky, because if you potentially paint yourself into a corner where you're like, I'm this type of leader, but really, let's say you're just not that type of person. I mean, that's hard to emulate. That's hard to
totally. And you're not going to be able to, because startups are so stressful. And like when something bad happens, you know, someone makes a mistake, and you've said like, you've said you're a servant leader and like you lift others up, and then, you know, you yell at someone because they made a mistake and you're pissed. Like you're not going to, if you don't actually believe it, like you're not going to be able to, it's just too stressful. So I think it's spot on. And like, it's a cliche about being a founder, but like people are always watching. Like your leadership style is just like every Slack message you send, you know, like the energy you show up with in all hands, like whether you're transparent or not about failures, like it's just the accumulation of that stuff. It doesn't have to be something like super wonky, but I mean, I totally agree. You should be able to back it up.
I guess founders imprint the culture, a leadership style. They imprint a lot onto the startup. Obviously, it's their company. When you look at leadership style, and then you look at quote unquote culture, and this is another murky one because I don't know if anyone has any unique definitions. Obviously, you do want alignment between what you say your culture is and then your leadership style, so that people can actually see the repetition and pattern and how you operate. When you look at that culture and you look at leadership style, what have you seen work to align the two together?
I'll go back to something you said at the beginning, actually, which is like the company imprints on the founder a lot. And I think an underrated phenomenon is how the company imprints on the first handful of employees a lot. I definitely feel like that has been the case with our company. And it sounds very cliche, but like, I think the first 10 folks we hired had as much an impact, like potentially more, on like the culture of the next hire than I did. Now, you could certainly argue that my co-founders and I had the impact of selecting those people, but there's certainly traits of our first 10 employees or so that we, weren't actively screening for, but just kind of emerged, and it was awesome. Like, I think about that group, and they're all very high ownership people who like just take pride in doing good work. And that's great. That's not something that's like unique to that group or our company, but it's a really great thing. And I think it created this vibe at our company where people wanted to do a good job because they saw others like really caring. And of course, I think every founder, what I'm trying to say is I think every founder emulates that, like, is that, right? Like what founder doesn't care about what they're doing? But I don't think that's why our company had that kind of mantra and value. I think it's because the first 10 people did. The implication of that is kind of a brutal implication, I think, which is that if you're not happy, and you're not really going to be able to suss this out in the interview process, unfortunately, unless you're able to do like a work trial or something. If, a month, 2 months in, like you look at a person on your team and you're like, I wouldn't want them to define the culture of my company, like they're probably not the right fit for your company. And it's like, and it's tricky because there's a near-term, long-term trade-off, because someone might be effective in the role, but might embody something that you feel like isn't the company you want to build. And like, you have to make the decision of, is it worth having a slower month to have that long-term benefit? That's kind of vague and abstract, right? Like maybe you're wrong. Maybe they will be, a good culture carrier or whatever. And I think something I learned, I think there are some mistakes that I made where I chose the kind of near term, because I was just like, look, we might not exist in a year. Like, I can't afford to make decisions that could harm our momentum in the near term. If we succeed and it ends up being a problem, like that'll be an amazing problem to have. And I think my advice to like effective, somewhat arrogant founders is just like assume you're going to build a massive company and make decisions on a longer time horizon, even if it feels like you're stunting your near-term momentum, because most of the time those decisions are not going to be life and death in the near term, but they could be, really, really meaningful in the long run. And I think like the cultural impact of your early employees is one of those things.
Yeah, as you were kind of talking about that, and I was thinking, you were mentioning obviously the trade-offs in real time is really hard to see. The example of the employee, are they going to come good? Are they going to be a detriment?
But they need to deliver on this project.
Yeah, but they have to deliver.
It's like the near term is so concrete and the long term is so vague.
So I guess as engineers, you do focus. I mean, a lot of the Scrum and Agile methodologies focus on the near term, right? I mean, we're told to build for the near term, think about the long term, have a backlog, but really that sprint is all you really are concerned about. When you think about your leader, and as you were kind of talking about that, I'm like, well, it sounds like an Agile way of thinking, because think about the near term. If I don't deliver on this, I can't show value to investors. I can't show value to my customers. I might not exist. It doesn't matter how elaborate the plan is, or what I think leadership's going to go. I guess when you think about, and I guess it worked out for you. You guys exited to Amplitude, so obviously the decisions you made did have a successful outcome from what we're seeing. So when you think about those decisions in the real time, if you were to go back and put yourself in some of those decisions, as a founder, especially first-time founders, are some of these decisions just you over-index on the value? Because I think you alluded to that, where it's like you put too much weight on some of these decisions, whereas if you just make them and go, like you said, if the employee doesn't work out 3 months in, you make a change, but waiting 6 months to find the person you think might work if they come through the door might not get you to the end goal anyways.
Totally. Yes. Often the only wrong thing to do is to take a long time to make the decision. Absolutely. Okay. So how do you actually do that? It's kind of obvious, but maybe just say it out loud. Like, I think the reason it's tough to make some of these decisions, a lot of decisions as the first time founders, you really just don't understand the second order, third order effects of things. So like a great example is laying someone off, firing someone. If you haven't done that before, you're like, unless you're a psychopath, you are going to catastrophize. You're going to like catastrophize how that conversation is going to go. You're going to imagine them yelling at you. You're going to imagine the person you're firing, suing you. you're going to imagine them writing a terrible Glassdoor review, because you just don't know how likely those outcomes are, and they like seem reasonable to you, right? Like, all those things like seem reasonable. So I remember, like, unfortunately, as is the case with many startups, like, we've had people who haven't worked out, and in those first few scenarios, like, my head definitely jumped there. And then you do it, and then you realize, okay, as long as you're not an asshole and you give people, you've been giving people feedback and you're human and you give good severance, like, and you let them say goodbye to their teammates, like, most of the time it works out. And so you don't have to worry about the second order effects. That's a kind of emotional example. But there are other examples, like, what CRM should I use? You just don't really know, like, unless you've been a salesperson or worked in a sales org, like, you just don't really know, like, what the implications of that are, how hard is it to switch off. And so every decision feels kind of trapdoor. Okay, so how do you not let this kind of analysis paralysis on every decision trap occur? You have to find a group of founders who are like 1 or 2 rounds ahead of you and be able to text them with questions like this, just to understand, like, is this actually a consequential decision? Investors typically are not the people to go to with those sort of types of very specific questions. Like, it's really knowledge that only founders have. And it's such a weird set of knowledge, right? It's like systems, it's like people stuff, it's sales stuff. Like, it's a really weird collection that only founders have. And I think this was, a huge part of what helped me as a first-time founder is like having this group of like 3 or 4 people who I could text. And if I get the same perspective from 2 or 3 of those people, like, hey, what CRM should I use? Salesforce. Okay, great. Like, a company's not going to live and die by that decision. I'm just going to make it and move on. But it is basically impossible, I think, as a first-time founder to be able to assess what are the kind of trapdoory decisions upfront without that group.
I love that advice. I talked to a lot of founders on the show, and the one thing I've taken away is this: there's so much pressure and stress on what seems to be like these knife edge decisions. In the real time, in the heat of the moment, it's probably hard to tell somebody, "Hey, listen, that CRM doesn't matter whether it's this or that." I mean, HubSpot.
You always feel like your company is a special snowflake, and like, but we're going to use our. And then I come back to the innovation thing, where it's like, you don't need to innovate on your CRM. Almost,
no, you don't need to.
Unless you're a CRM company.
That's actually good. And again, in this example, you're right. You don't need to innovate. You just need the building blocks to go do.
You could use a spreadsheet. You could use HubSpot. You could use Salesforce. Like, it really doesn't matter.
So you mentioned turning to obviously other founders. So when we're coming back to maybe the leadership style question, as you're trying to understand yourself, right? And I think the more of the personal journey as a founder, do you turn to those other founders to ask questions about leadership style? Are there other people that you would turn to, obviously, to kind of gauge your co-founders? Hey, because the feedback's the hardest thing. When you own the company, you're a founder, there's not many people left to evaluate you. That's a real challenge.
Yes, but I will say that it's getting like positive reinforcement from the people you work with on like things you do is like the most amazing feeling. Like, oh my God, you appreciate the energy I bring to all hands. Like, I had no idea if that was. It's kind of like when you're in your first job. I remember this in my first job, 6 month performance reviews. Right in month 4, like, I was literally like, I could be the worst employee of all time, like about to be fired, or like the greatest ever. And I just had no idea. And I think being a first-time founder like often feels like that. And so getting those, because of the dynamic you mentioned, where like people aren't like super forthcoming with feedback for you a lot. And so getting those like morsels of positive or negative reinforcement is like so valuable. Yes, to answer your question directly, I do think you can go to that group with questions around leadership style. But I think it takes the form of more concrete questions like, hey, how do you run your all hands? Can I sit in on your all hands? Incredibly valuable thing to do, because that's a really high leverage weekly ritual. And like most of the time, you've only been in like 3 or 4 all hands, maybe if you worked at 3 or 4 startups, and that's like the maximum experience possible. Me, I had never been in an all hands before I we started the company, and Richard, Vinay, and I had to like figure out how to do all hands. And I would say, like, just to be really concrete about this, like, founder mentors thing, like, if you are not texting someone who's a founder who you trust doesn't have to be text, whatever, communicating with a founder you trust about a decision you're making at least once a month, then like I guarantee you are wasting like days spending time on decisions that you don't have to be. If you're a first-time founder, if you're a second-time founder, you've made the decision before, you can be your own advice. I still think it's useful to get the perspective of others, but like way less important. And I just think it's really important to be concrete about like the frequency. And ideally, it's way more often. Like companies that I angel invest in, like the best companies, like and it's not just me. Like I'm not saying I'm the giver of great advice. It's just they're coming to me with these questions, and it's like, oh my god, you should, for example, how should we write a JD? Here's an example of a company that has great JDs. If you vibe with that, copy that format. And for the companies that aren't asking questions, hopefully they're getting advice from others, which is totally fine, probably better. But I often fear that they're in their heads about these things. So at least once a month, if you're a founder listening to this, like please find someone you can connect with at least once a month. Just really quick. This isn't like teach me about how to be a leader. It's just here's some tactical questions.
Yeah, I mean that's great insight. And I was actually going to ask you maybe as a final question. You went through the process. I think most founders hope to achieve some kind of outcome, whether it's an exit.
No one wants their company to be acquired, but yes, yeah, I appreciate you saying that.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that acquisition, exit, pub. I think there's a goal as a founder you have that you're hoping to get a positive outcome. As you look back on your experience, if you were to go back and maybe pick out one or two things where you look back and go, oh, those are things where if I would have maybe known or would have seen things differently, it would have helped me. I mean, it's pretty recent, so I don't know what your thoughts are, but are there a couple things that stand out to you?
I feel really lucky with the early team we hired, and I'll just praise them. And like, I think they had a huge impact on our culture. Boring answer, but like, I have to give them a shout out. I think the biggest thing that maybe I'll reframe the question slightly, like if I do another company, like what experience do I feel like will be most valuable? And it's kind of a cop out, but what is actual product market fit? Like just the difference between like having to work really hard for every deal and having every deal feel like a little bit weird and having people want to use your product and pay you because they like you, and versus like they just really want the product and they couldn't really give a shit about you. Here's actually a little very tactical tip. Early on, when if this is really a B2B thing, if your customers are telling you like our favorite thing about working with you is the team, that is a red flag. It does not feel like a red flag. It feels amazing. You're like, great, that's one of our best assets. Thank you so much. Our team is so great. I'm so great. Like, thank you. But that's actually a huge red flag because you're not selling your team. You're selling a product. And unless you're a service business, caveat. But that's bad. That's actually bad. And that's a good example, I think, of something you can only really experience as someone who's been on both sides of what product market fit, at least what I feel product market fit to be. And I'll make another plug for the kind of founder mentor thing, which is having someone who has been on the other side of product market fit, like audit your product market fit and like look at the emails you're having with prospects and like look at usage and be like, hey dude, I don't think you have product market fit. Or, oh my God, wow, like you should hit the gas. So useful because I think we, on our product direction, could have saved ourselves years had we been clear-eyed about our product market fit with the first version of our product. And I think we conflated like revenue trajectory with product market fit. And the second time around, I will be much better at discerning those two things. But the first time around, you can be better as well if you just find someone to help you differentiate between those two things.
Fantastic. I like that quite a bit, James. That's a good one to end on. Obviously, we talked about a lot of different things within the concept of a first-time founder and the leadership style. If someone does have a question or wants to maybe just pick your brain, follow up with you, is there a good way of connecting with you?
I really set myself up as a giver of free advice because, I got to be the person who's giving that tactical founder advice if you don't have that person. I'm happy to play that role. Yeah, just LinkedIn or Twitter.
Okay, awesome. We'll make sure, hopefully, people will reach out to you with those specific questions.
Happy to give advice about product market fit or CRMs or other
there you go.
items.
James, pleasure to have you on. Thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it. Absolutely. All right, that's it for the episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. I think James provides some concrete takeaways on what you should be looking for as a first-time founder, some of those leadership styles. Talking to a founder at least once a month that you trust, I think that's a really big key. I don't think people maybe take advantage of that enough or have the network to. And I think in James's case, please look for that person. It is a little bit of time, but I think the upside and benefit that James outlined is tremendous. Also, please share this with somebody else who is a founder, who wants to be a founder. I think a lot of great takeaways. Hopefully you can incorporate some of James's learning before you start or are too far down the road. Also, like, subscribe, comment. Please let me know how the podcast is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.